So today I'm going to go over one of my favorite monsters. It's my favorite monster ever since I was a kid was a skeleton. In fact, if any of you guys have ever played Warhammer Fantasy, I was a huge Vampire Counts player as a kid. And no matter how much the editions changed from, oh, you need to have an entire army of ghouls, or, oh, you need these certain vampires, my dudes were always skeletons with some necromancers. Maybe we can go a little bit further in that too and say that my favorite character in Diablo 2 was the necromancer because he could raise a bunch of skeletons to fight people for him. With that being said, I came into Dungeons and Dragons, and when I started making my own dungeons, I wanted to put skeletons in there. Skeletons and hobgoblins being one of my two favorite groups of mooks. For skeletons, I found that the 5th edition statistics weren't exactly the greatest for them, so I kind of played around with them when I was making different like dungeon treks, and I'd change up their armor and weapons and attacks. But eventually I got into looking at old school gaming, and I looked at the older editions of skeletons, and I noticed that the older editions and versions of skeletons were a lot more difficult, tougher to fight. Though they all had their own special little traits. So with that in mind, I decided to make this video pointing out how skeletons have changed through the ages. I'm going to go over the Rules Cyclopedia version, the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons version, 2nd edition, the 3rd edition. I'm not going to do 4th edition at all, and the 5th edition statistics on skeletons. Alright, going back into time, we're going to start off with the Rules Cyclopedia version of the skeleton. This version is immune to poison, spells that affect the mind, such as sleep, charm, hold, discord, insanity, and feeble mind. AC, or armor class at the time, was 7, which is the equivalent of AC 12 or 13 in 5th edition. It only had one attack, and it says specifically it's damage by weapon, so it didn't actually give you a certain damage like editions 2 through 5 have given. Its Thaco was 19, which is sort of like a +1 to hit modifier nowadays. It's fearless, and it saves as a fighter 1. This is the negative for this one. It only has a 20 foot move, which is 10 foot slower than most of your normal player characters in this edition. And it has a hit die of a D8. The flavor text for it says, often used as guards by high-level magic users or clerics, or greater undead creatures, often found near graves, dungeons, and other deserted places. The Rules Cyclopedia also says it's actually a common creature to run into. Now, the next version is the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons version of the skeleton. This one goes a lot more in depth into what the creature is resistant to. It's immune to cold spells, sleep, charm, and hold. It takes half damage from piercing and slashing weapons, full damage from blunt weapons and fire, and it also takes 2 to 8 points of damage per vial of holy water. This version statistics gives it an AC of 7, which is equivalent of 5th edition's AC 13. It has one attack, and it only does 1 to 6 points of damage no matter what kind of weapon it's wielding. It says it because of the lack of ligaments and muscles. It always does 1 to 6 points of damage. Its Thaco is 19, or the modern version of +1 to hit. It's fearless, it fights until it's destroyed, and it moves 12 inches, which is the equivalent of moving 30 feet in today's version of the game. For flavor text, it says it's created by powerful magic users or clerics of an evil alignment. Skeletons perform according to the commands of its animator, the commands being limited to a dozen or 2 words, and it's only found in dungeons, burial places, and similar forsaken places. It also goes on to say that this is actually a rare creature, which differs from the Rules Cyclopedia version. It also has up to 8 hit points, just like the previous version. Now, the 2nd edition version of the skeleton is almost exactly the same as the 1st edition version of the skeleton, statistic-wise. It's immune to all sleep, charm, and hold spells. It takes no damage from cold spells, and half damage from piercing and slashing weapons, full damage from blunt and fire, and it takes 2 to 8 points of damage from holy water. It's got an AC of 7, which is the equivalent of AC 13. Its movement's 12 inches, which is exactly like 30 feet in today's version. It has D8 hit points. It's got a Thaco of 19, which is +1 to hit. It does 1d6 no matter what type of weapon it's using, and it's also fearless. Now, the 2nd edition version the entry inside their monster manual actually has a lot more information on their combat, their habitat and society, and their ecology. The statistics also contain rules for animal skeletons and monster skeletons. But I'm just going over the human sort of skeleton for these. Now, for flavor text, this one has all skeletons are magically animated undead monsters created as guardians or warriors by powerful evil wizards and priests. Skeletons appear to have no ligaments or musculature which would allow movement. Instead, the bones are magically joined together during the casting of an animate dead spell. Skeletons have no eyes or internal organs. Skeletons can be made from the bones of humans and demi-humans, animals of human size or smaller, or giant humanoids like bugbears and giants. The combat section says that man-sized humanoid skeletons always fight with weapons, usually a rusty sword or spear, but because of their magical nature, they don't fight as well as living beings, only inflicting 1 to 6 points of damage when they hit. Skeletons are immune to all forms of sleep, charm, and hold spells. Because they are summoned from bones, cold-based attacks also do skeletons no harm. The fact that they're mostly empty means that edged or piercing weapons, like swords, daggers, or spears, inflict only half the damage when employed against them. Blunt weapons with larger heads designed to break and crush bone cause normal damage against skeletons, and fire also does normal amounts of damage against them. Skeletons are immune to fear spells and never need to check morale, usually being magic commanded to fight to the death. When a skeleton dies, it falls to pieces with loud clunks and rattles. Now it has a little section for the habitat and society of skeletons. It says, skeletons have no social life or interesting habits. They can be found anywhere there is a wizard or priest powerful enough to make them. Note that some neutral priests and deities of the dead or dying often raise whole armies of animated followers in times of trouble. Good clerics can make skeletons only if the dead being has granted permission, either before or after death, and if the cleric's deity has given express permission to do so. Otherwise, violating the eternal rest of any being or animal is something most good deities disapprove of. Skeletons have no minds whatsoever and can obey only the simplest 1 or 2 phrase orders from the creators. Skeletons fight in unorganized masses and tend to botch complex orders disastrously. It's not unheard of to find more than one type of skeleton, monster with animals, animals with humans, working together to protect their master's dungeon or tower. Now, this differs from the first edition version where it said it could follow a set of commands that's a dozen or 2 words, where in this one it says it can only follow the simplest 1 or 2 phrase orders, which I guess could come out to almost 2 dozen words. But the next section, called the ecology of skeletons, it says that unless the skeleton's remains are destroyed or scattered far apart, the skeleton can created anew with the application of another animate dead spell. Rumors of high-level animate dead spells which create skeletons capable of reforming themselves to continue fighting after being destroyed have not been reliably confirmed. Now, the second edition Monster Manual also contains rules for skeleton giants and skeleton warriors, which is interesting, but those aren't things I'm going to go over for this review. The third edition version of the skeleton, the actual entry in the Monster Manual, contains quite a few different versions of skeleton. It's got rules for tiny skeletons, small skeletons, medium-sized skeletons, large skeletons, huge skeletons, gargantuan skeletons, and colossal skeletons. The one I'm going to be going over is going to be the medium-sized skeleton. As with the other entries, I'm going to talk about its resistances before I go over the stats. In 3rd edition, the skeletons are immune to cold damage, along with being immune to mind-influencing effects such as poison, sleep, paralysis, stunning, and disease. They're not subject to critical hits, subdual damage, ability damage, energy drain, or death from massive damage. They continue to take only half damage from piercing or slashing weapons. However, there doesn't appear to be any entries about using holy water against them. For the statistics themselves, it looks like these skeletons actually can have between 1 to 12 hit points using 1d12. Their movement speed is 30 feet, which is common. Its armor class is 13, and it says it has 2 attacks, which is 2 claws, at +0 to hit. Now, for flavor text for this edition, it says that skeletons are animated bones of the dead, mindless automatons that obey the orders of their evil masters. These undead creatures are seldom garbed with anything more than the rotting remnants of any armor they were wearing when slain. Pinpoints of red light smolder in their empty eye sockets. Skeletons do only what they are ordered to do. They can draw no conclusions of their own and take no initiative. Because of this limitation, their instructions must always be simple, such as kill anyone who enters the chamber. Now, I feel that it's lost a lot of capabilities since the change from 2nd edition to 3rd edition. This skeleton apparently does not know how to use weapons. It does have the 2 attacks by claw, but each one of the claw attacks is only at 1d4 points of damage. And apparently it's not very good at hitting people either. It still has all the old immunities of the previous version of Skeleton. I just don't like the fact that it appears the book doesn't think that skeletons should be using weapons. Now, the 4th edition skeleton I am not going to go over. I'm going to go straight to the 5th edition version of the skeleton. For the 5th edition skeleton, it has the condition immunities of exhaustion and poison. It's immune to poison damage, and it is vulnerable to bludgeoning damage. It doesn't have any sort of resistances to slashing or piercing weapons at all. It has 2d8 hit points, so it's got more health than the previous versions. It's got an armor class of 13, and it has a plus 4 to hit with its melee attacks, which is, in the book, it has it as a short sword or a short bow, giving it about 1d6 plus 2 points of damage per strike. It moves just as quick as a normal player character at 30 feet per round. Now, this version of Skeleton has a little bit more flavored text in the entry. It says that skeletons arise when animated by dark magic. They heed the summons of spellcasters who called them from their stony tombs and ancient battlefields, or rise of their own accord in places saturated with death and loss, awakened by a stirring of necromantic energy or the presence of corrupting evil. That's a little bit different from the previous versions, which pretty much each said that skeletons are raised by evil magic users or clerics. The next section of flavor text is labeled Animated Dead. Whatever sinister force awakens a skeleton infuses its bones with a dark vitality, adhering joint to joint and reassembling dismantled limbs. This energy motivates the skeleton to move and to think in a rudimentary fashion, though only as a pale imitation of the way it behaved in life. An animated skeleton retains no connection to its past, although resurrecting a skeleton restores its body and soul, banishing the hateful undead spirit that empowers it. While most skeletons are the animated remains of dead humans and other humanoids, skeletal undead can be created from the bones of other creatures beside humanoids, giving rise to a host of terrifying and unique forms. I don't really know what's going on here. It says that the skeleton retains part of its memories from the past, but then it says if the skeleton is resurrected, the undead spirit that empowered it is gone. So is there a undead evil spirit that inhabits the skeleton? The skeleton has a part of the soul of the original inhabitant? Are they having a conflict of thoughts inside their heads at the time? I don't know. It doesn't really go further into it from there. It's got another section called Obedient Servants. Skeletons raised by a spell are bound to the will of the Creator. They follow orders to the letter, never questioning the task their masters give them, regardless of the consequences. Because of their literal interpretations of commands and unwavering obedience, skeletons adapt poorly to changing circumstances. They can't read, speak, emote, or communicate in any way except to nod, shake their heads, or point. Still, skeletons are able to accomplish a variety of relatively complex tasks. A skeleton can fight with weapons and wear armor, can load and fire a catapult or trebuchet, scale a siege ladder, form a shield wall, or dump boiling oil. However, it must receive careful instructions explaining how such tasks are accomplished. Although they lack the intellect they possessed in life, skeletons aren't mindless. Rather than break its limbs attempting to batter its way through an iron door, the skeleton tries the handle first. If that doesn't work, it searches for another way through or around the obstacle. And the last and final section is the habitual behaviors of skeletons. Independent skeletons temporarily or permanently free of a master's control sometimes pantomime actions from their past, their bones echoing the rote behaviors of their former living selves. The skeleton of a miner might lift up a pick and start chipping away at a stone wall. The skeleton of a guard might strike up a post at a random doorway. The skeleton of a dragon might lie down on a pile of treasure, while the skeleton of a horse crops grass it can't eat. Left alone in a ballroom, the skeletons of nobles might continue an eternally unfinished dance. When skeletons encounter living creatures, the necromantic energy that drives them compels them to kill unless they are commanded by their masters to refrain from doing so. They attack without mercy and fight until destroyed, for skeletons possess little sense of self and even less sense of self-preservation. And it has a little bottom section here that I guess points out the fact that skeletons have an undead nature, and they don't require air, food, drink, or sleep. So as much as I didn't like the 3rd edition of the skeleton and being unable to use weapons, and the fact that the 5th edition skeleton can now use weapons, shields, and armor as described in its flavor text, I'm not much of a fan of the 5th edition version skeleton because of its lack of immunities that were commonplace in almost every single previous edition except for the Rules Cyclopedia version. For my skeletons, when I ran them in the game, I gave them back the fact that they were resistant to piercing and slashing weapons, and they received normal damage from blunt weapons. It made them a whole lot scarier than fighting zombies, especially if you add in the fact that zombies are supposed to be mindless undead, while skeletons are somewhat thinking. So that'll be it for this video, Skeletons Through the Ages. I hope somebody enjoyed this video and maybe you get something out of it. Maybe you make your 5th edition skeletons also be resistant to slashing and piercing weapons. Made sense to me. I mean, if you stab a skeleton with a spear, there's a chance you're not going to hit anything since it's mostly bone.